The 3-clue rule for those who aren't familiar with it. Here's a list of 36 skills, and here are 100 points. Spend the 100 points between the 36 skills. One of my favorite games, thinking about conspiracies, is a game called Technor, which was originally published by Jeremy Keller. And this is actually a case where I loved the game so much I bought the company.
Hello, Justin. Welcome to our podcast channel. We have here John, Alex, and my name is Tony. A small intro to get you into context of our conversation. So, I don't know if you know that, but tabletop RPGs have been developing in Ukraine since 90s. We joined the party quite late, well, 20 years later. But now the RPG community has grown to the point where we have hundreds of creators. We publish our own games, our own adventures for existing games, for our own games, right? More and more games are being translated into Ukrainian, and this gives community another boost, right? So eventually, three of us decided that we acquired enough of experience of being a game master, and we established this channel just to show other people that being a game master is not as scary as people think, and is rewarding pretty much as the same way it is rewarding for a player. We also, three of us, we published several adventures for D&D. We have adventure book for Mouse Reader released, and last year we even made a festival dedicated to tabletop RPGs. So we hosted that, had about 600 people attending there. And eventually we invited you, Justin, first of all, as your fans, you're truly fans, but also to introduce you to wider audience here in Ukraine, as your many advices really helped us to grow and improve in the hobby.
Well, it's super exciting to be here. I really appreciate you guys having me on. It's great to meet all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, long story short, Justin is an actor and famous game master and Annie award-winning game designer, and also he's a blogger. His blog, the Alexandrian, has become some kind of legendary source of GM advices, renowned by excellent remixes and remixes of official adventures and for D&D and other systems, and also GM tools like 3-clue rules and Zendaren dungeons and others. So, Justin, can you tell us quickly how you discovered tabletop RPGs as a hobby, and how did you become a GM in the first place?
Yeah, so I've been doing it a little bit longer. I got into it in the summer of 1989, and back then, over here in the States, role-playing games just kind of in the air for me. There were advertisements in our comic books. The E.T. movie had come out, and there were people playing a role-playing game in that. There was just a lot of things around that talked about these role-playing games, and they sounded really cool to me. The difficulty back then was that there wasn't a internet for me to go on and Google, how do I play role-playing games? And so it was up to me to kind of just wander through stores and kind of try to figure out, what is this game I've been hearing about, and where can I find it? I was also only 10 years old, so it was a little bit more difficult for me to go out and search the marketplace. My first memory of actually seeing a role-playing game was actually at a comic book convention, where I was looking through a bin of Batman back issues, and they had put a copy of the Batman role-playing game, which was published by Mayfair back in 1989 to tie into the Tim Burton movie. And I'm going, this is it. I love superheroes. I've been wanting to play these role-playing games, and here's a role-playing game, and I can buy it right now. So I bought it right then. And I read through that book cover to cover, and I had no idea how to play the game. There was all these rules, and there was dice, but there was no explanation of what you actually kind of did at the table. And I kind of floundered around for a bit. So my first role-playing game experience actually was okay, well, if I'm reading this book and I can't figure it out, I'm just going to do it for myself. And so my actual first time playing role-playing games with my brother, and I was like, I don't understand this Batman game, but Batman can be a role-playing game. And we both like Batman, so let's do Batman. So I know this is supposed to be like a game master, so I'll be that. And my brother will play Batman. That makes sense. And I know that we're supposed to roll dice to determine the outcome of events. And so what I came up with in the infinite wisdom of 10 years old with no experience playing role-playing games was a very simple role-playing game engine where anytime Batman tried to do something, my brother would roll a d6 for Batman, and I would roll a d6 against him as the world opposing him. And if Batman rolled higher than I did, then Batman would do whatever it was he wanted to do. And if I rolled higher than Batman, then Batman would fail. And my memory is that that game ended very quickly because Batman crashed the Batmobile driving to Gotham to respond to the bat signal. And we both figured out there's something we're not doing right. There's something that's missing from what this game is. And so what eventually got me into actually understanding and how to play and run role-playing games was the 1983 Dungeons and Dragons basic set by Frank Menser, which is like the red box, the infamous red box. And Frank Menser just did an excellent job in that box set of presenting. First thing he did was you presented a solo play adventure that kind of walked you through how to play the game in a kind of choose your own adventure kind of style, which was like, oh, this is how the mechanics work. Great, I get it. Then he walked you through character creation. Like, okay, now that I've done the mechanics, I understand why I'm creating a character. And then the DM's book in that box set did give like very detailed instructions on like, this is how you make a dungeon and this is how you run a dungeon. And so that actually was like, okay, now I have a step-by-step process and I can actually play this game. And then as the very long-winded answer to your question, that's how I got started in role-playing games.
That's nice.
So you were the very first person to come up with this hobby. You had no friends or siblings who could play any type of tabletop RPGs. And in my mind, it is quite impossible to like imagine how this game should work without someone explaining it to you. So
I think that's definitely true. There was actually a period in time, like throughout the whole 90s, where I had a theorem, which was that everybody playing role-playing games had either bought a basic set of D&D, which was one of the few products that actually told you how to play, or they had been taught by someone who had bought a basic set. Like there was like a degree of separation for a very long time. And I think one of the big things about like why role-playing games have been exploding in a lot of places, including Ukraine, recently is actually streaming video. The fact that actual play podcasts and videos give people the ability to just watch people playing the game is an invaluable substitute for the fact that there are actually so few written sources of information laying out that step-by-step process.
And it also influences how the game is being played by the popularity of streaming media or the games.
It seems that this has been quite a journey for you, and you made a book recently. This is it. So you want to be a game master, sorry. A lot of people said that it was like the real Dungeon Master's Guide. My personal opinion is that it fills very nicely the gaps where official D&D Dungeon Master's Guide lacks some game structure, systems, and the most important that we just discussed, the examples of play, like the actual narrated examples of play, which is super good at communicating that how the game should be played. So how you would describe your book? Who is it for, and what has driven you to write it?
I think, John, you've actually done a great job of describing it already, but I'll elaborate a little bit. Yeah, you're 100% right, which is that So You Want to Be a Game Master is a book that I wanted to write because I felt that there was a void in the hobby. And it was specifically that void that 10-year-old me needed. Like I went through the Batman role-playing game. I actually skipped over the other two role-playing games that I got my hands on and read through and couldn't figure out what to do with them because they didn't explain what you were supposed to actually do at the table. And it was only that red box experience that like told you, okay, here's how you build a dungeon. Here's the steps for running a dungeon. This is how you play. And so there is a void in the role-playing game hobby that has developed over the years where and I describe it as like it's a passive neglect because what you have is you have designers who learned how to run a dungeon either from somebody else or from one of these early D&D sets that actually did teach you how to run a dungeon, for example. And they think to themselves, well, okay, that's how you run a dungeon. It's obvious how you run a dungeon. Why would I need to explain that to people? Here's a map and here's some numbers and away you go, right? But the reality is that it is, in fact, a skill to design it and a skill to run it. And so I thought back to my 10-year-old self, the one who was reading these other games and couldn't figure out how to get into the game because he couldn't figure out how the game worked. He couldn't figure out how to prep a game. He couldn't figure out how to run a game. And I wanted to write a book for that 10-year-old who needed these guidelines. And so You Want to Be a Game Master supplies those step-by-step procedures. And not only for dungeons now, but I also do mysteries and raids and heists and urban crawls and wilderness adventures. All of those get broken down into, hopefully, a sort of comprehensive overview of not just what this adventure is, but what you prep to make it work, and then how you use that prep at the table to bring your game to life. And I think when people describe the book as like what the Dungeon Master's Guide should have been, I think that's what they're responding to, is that it's not just advice. It is a plan. It is a plan that you can follow that will get you from where you are now to playing at the table with your friends.
That's great.
Oh,
yeah.
I believe that your book is kind of like the next step, the evolution or the essence of your blog, right? So, which is a legend by its own right, and but mostly in USA or English-speaking countries, right? And here it's unjustly overlooked, I would say. So, just again to introduce more people to your blog, can you tell us what have led you to creation of that blog, and what are your top 3 favorite or most impactful creations there?
Ooh, that's a big question. So,
sorry.
No, I like the big questions. Let's dive in, right? So the origins of the blog actually sort of predate the blog, which is that I got into freelancing in the role-playing games industry in the late 90s. And I was writing a lot of reviews for a variety of sites and magazines. I wrote a variety of magazine articles. I wrote a number of books for companies like Steve Jackson Games and DreamPod 9 and Fantasy Flight Games. And a few years pass, and I begin getting a lot of queries from people saying, hey, I remember reading this review of yours or this article of yours, and now I can't find it. Where can I get it? And they would email me, and I would email them back. And after several of these, I was like, okay, clearly this material is no longer available because it was in a magazine or a website that's gone defunct or whatever. People want to be able to find it, so I should try and figure out some way to make that accessible to them. So I don't have to, if nothing else, it'll stop me from having to answer all these emails. And so I made a website, and I call it the Alexandrian. The idea was that it would be a place where I would upload all of these old articles and content that wasn't otherwise available. It would be an archive of my work. And that's kind of how the website got started, was just archiving old content. The big turning point for the website was that I was in a discussion on a blog, and on the blogs, in the comment sections blog, we were talking about the way that encumbrance worked in D&D. Very esoteric conversation. But there were some ideas I was sharing in there, and one of the other people participating in the conversation said, would you write this up at a greater length? I'd love to read more about this. And I said, okay, sure, I can do that. And I have this website where I can post it. And so kind of just at the prompting of this woman on this blog post, I wrote up an article called D&D Calibrating Your Expectations, which looked at why the D&D rules like encumbrance and so forth work the way they do, and the efforts that have been made by the 3rd edition D&D designers to actually sort of tie game mechanical values to sort of real world values, and how interpreting those things meant that you could learn things about what game mechanical results meant. And broadly, it looked at the fact that like people are like, oh, like Conan and Aragorn are 20th level characters because they're the best ever. And it's like, well, they're not really 20th level characters in D&D, because 20th level characters in D&D are basically demigods, and Aragorn is just kind of a guy. And so like a lot of the characters that we think of as like the best fantasy characters ever are really kind of like 5th or 6th level in D&D. And when we build those expectations that like we play these 20th level characters in D&D and we think, oh, we should be getting results from the game mechanics that look like Aragorn or Conan. And then the game mechanics are like, no, you're getting results like Hercules or like some other demigod. Like, you can call meteor storms down from the heavens. There is a sort of nascent frustration that can happen because we're looking for one game experience and the mechanics are delivering a different. That's a broad summary of the article. Anyways, long story short, that article got posted by somebody else on a site called Stumble Upon, which was a early sort of viral media kind of thing. And whoever that was, like, thank you. I don't to this day know who did it, but that article hit on the Stumble Upon site, and suddenly I went from having a few dozen people per day visiting my website to having thousands of people visiting my website. And that made a huge difference, because once you have an audience, you can create content and not feel like you're just howling into the void. And so that's really how the Alexandrian got started, was that Stumble Upon post, because then I was like, oh, well, if there's an audience for this, I can write some more stuff. And then the next major article I wrote was called the 3-Clue Rule. And that also got posted by someone to Stumble Upon, and that also went viral. And then it's kind of just been a stone rolling down the hill ever since for me. To answer the second part of your question, which was, what are sort of the 3 biggest articles on the website? Well, I think one of them actually is the 3-Clue Rule. So the 3-Clue Rule, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a method for designing mystery scenarios. And the basic idea is that if you're going to design a mystery scenario in a role-playing game, then you need to have a certain robustness to that scenario so it doesn't break. A very common problem in mystery scenarios, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, is that, you know, you're playing a scene, there's an essential clue that the PCs need to find to follow the breadcrumb trail to the next scene. You roll the check for them to find the clue, and they don't find it. So they can't get to the next scene, and the whole scenario is broken, and now what do you do? And there's a whole bunch of workarounds for that. But the 3-Clue Rule basically takes a step back and says, hey, look, there's actually several ways that can fail. It's not just the dice check. The PCs might never look for the clue in the first place because they don't think to look for it. If they don't find it because of the dice roll, obviously that's a problem. Even if they find the clue, they might misinterpret it. And then even if they interpret it correctly, they still need to take whatever action was suggested by the clue. Like, they may be like, oh, yeah, this suggests that so-and-so is involved. And then for some reason, players being players, they might never go talk to that person for some reason. And all of those things can lead to the adventure breaking. And then you're just kind of stuck. The 3-Clue Rule says that for any conclusion you want the PCs to reach, you should include at least any conclusion you want the PCs to reach, you should include at least 3 clues pointing to that conclusion. And the idea is that basically there's just redundancy then. Maybe they miss a clue. Maybe they misinterpret a clue. Maybe they ignore a clue. But the overall across the 3 separate clues, at some point, in my experience, that redundancy is enough to give a mystery scenario enough robustness that it probably won't break in play most of the time. And so that article kind of came out and talked about mystery scenarios. And the reason why that was so important for the site was it was the first example of me talking about scenario design on the site. And if the site has in any way become legendary, as you keep saying, and which I'm not sure my headphones are going to keep putting on my head if it keeps swelling up like that, but it's because of the work I've done breaking down what I call scenario structures. And this is, again, kind of what the book is about as well, which is looking at these different types of adventures and thinking, okay, what is the structure of that adventure? And by that, I mean, again, what do we prep? How do we prep it? Like, what structure does that prep take? And then what's the actual procedure that we use to bring that prep to the table? And the 3-Clue Rule is a basic example of this, where the structure of a very basic mystery is you have a scene, and there are 3 clues in that scene that point you to the next scene. Well, there will be 3 more clues that point you to the next scene until eventually that trail of clues leads you to the end of the mystery scenario. And so it's a very basic scenario structure for running mysteries, but it works. And that's something that a lot of people have struggled with when trying to run their first mystery scenario at a role-playing game table, is that it just doesn't work for them. And then they get frustrated and they have to find a different way. So that's a very important article. Several years later, I would write a series called Game Structures, which actually looked not just at scenario structures, but other game structures that we use, like how does combat work in a role-playing game, for example. That was kind of a seminal article for me because it was the point where I went from being like, here's how a mystery works, to thinking, actually, if I can do dungeons and I can do mysteries, then there must be other scenario structures out there. There must be a structure to how you play a heist, for example. And so that was kind of a major breakthrough for me, and I think for a lot of other people as well, thinking about the way that we approach the stories that we want to tell and the scenarios that we want to present to our players at the gaming table. So I'll pick those two. And then I think another major article for me was this might be cheating a little because it's a lot of articles on the website, but it's the Dragon Heist remix. So I'm sure you're familiar with the official D&D campaign, Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And I had not really gotten involved with D&D 5th edition too much for a variety of reasons, but I read about D&D's Waterdeep campaign, this Dragon Heist campaign, and I was like, this sounds great, because the way they pitched it was that it was going to be this cool sort of heist-based game with a lot of urban intrigue, and then there's going to be this big connection between this urban intrigue heist game and this mega dungeon Undermountain in a separate book, and it was all going to be linked together. I was like, well, that sounds like exactly the type of stuff I love in my fantasy campaign. So I grabbed a copy of Dragon Heist and discovered none of that was in there. There were no heists. There was no connection to Undermountain, and the urban intrigue was really kind of missing as well. And I was like, well, this isn't great. But I began talking about it a bit on my website, and I realized, look, there's some very simple things you can do to take full advantage of this material. You just have to remix the underlying structure of the adventure to take full advantage of it. Like a good example of this is that the book is published, includes 4 different villains, and you're supposed to choose one of them. And then also the book includes like a different hideout for each of those villains. So like 50 or 60 pages of like hideouts for the villains. But the book is like, you must not let the players go to any of these hideouts. They will die. And in anyways, they won't, because there's no way to get there. And I was like, well, why is this in the book then? So long story short, I wrote this big remix of Dragon Heist, and it was a way of looking at both like, how do we structure our adventures? How can we bring the potential of Dragon Heist to full life? And that was a very popular article, and I think showcases a lot of the things that the Alexandrian has to offer.
Yeah, so
actually, personally, Strictly Rules was the first article I read of you. Yeah, obviously we'll include every article you spoke of in the description of this video. And actually...
font of all knowledge.
And the font of all knowledge.
And actually, we all played your remix. John ran for us, so...
Yeah, I actually ran the Dragon Heist remix, and from the start to the end, and we all enjoyed it. I enjoyed deming it a lot, and now I'm running the Descent into Avernus remix, which is a big campaign. And yeah, and I love your structured approach to adventure design. Sometimes it's almost overwhelming, but I think in the end it simplifies it a lot, because when things make sense, it makes it more simpler, actually.
Well, so, I know Dragon Heist was a tough one too, because I wrote the Dragon Heist remix as a way of talking about adventure design initially. And about 5 or 6 installments into talking about adventure design, I realized that what I had was lots and lots of people coming who wanted to actually run the campaign, and the material wasn't organized that way. The material is organized as a way of talking about stuff. And so I know Dragon Heist can sometimes be a bit of a frustrating experience because of that, a little bit harder to get on top of. And then Descent into Avernus, like you say, it turned into a bit of a monster. I launched the Descent into Avernus remix the first week of March in 2020. And so I launched the remix, and I was like, I'm launching this remix. I'm going to be running the campaign in a couple of weeks. It's going to be great. And then COVID happened, and we went into lockdown, and I never, so it was a very weird place for that remix.
Yeah, I could only imagine the amount of work that took. But what do you think there are common issues with official adventures? Maybe have you created in the past or considered creating your own adventures for 5e specifically? Maybe with collaboration with someone else. I know we interviewed also another legend, if I want to say so, Kit Baker. Maybe you know him, the creator of Aberrant Setting. I think
do, yeah.
that would be like the gift from the gods if it would be like adventure in Eberron settings by your authorship, let's say. So
That would be really cool. I guess we'll start with my desire to write 5th edition adventures. I absolutely would. I've got a couple of things I've been kind of working on that I would love to see come out as projects. I mainly the main reason I haven't really done anything specifically along those lines is that I've been busy, I guess is the short version. In addition to doing the Alexandrian, I also have worked for a company called Modifius, who publishes a wide variety of English language RPGs. I was the line developer for the Infinity role-playing game for them, which is a space opera setting, and also co-wrote a campaign called the Acheron Cascade, and also developed a campaign with Nick Bate called Quantronic Heat for that game. So if you are looking for some of my adventure design stuff, those are places to look. I then ended up becoming the RPG developer for Atlas Games. And so at Atlas Games, I published an anthology of adventures called Welcome to the Island for Over the Edge, and also developed with other creators a number of adventures for their Feng Shui RPG, which is a Hong Kong action movie RPG. So those are all, if you're looking for places like, hey, where's the Alexandrian, where's Justin Alexander published adventures, those are kind of those have been sort of my day job, and I've been working on those. And also Magical Kitties Save the Day, which is a role-playing game where everyone plays a magical kitty, and I've done some adventure design work for that as well. But I do have some ideas for D&D adventures, and I would love to have that. And man, working with Keith Baker on Eberron would be an amazing opportunity. I would love to have that dream come true.
So the question was also like what flows do you think, or what are the most common problems on existing 5e material adventure-wise? You seem to do a lot of reviews also, so what do you think?
Yeah, so, and I want to say these are not problems that are necessarily limited to D&D adventures either. They are something that is you can see in a lot of published adventures, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of understanding the structure of the adventure. And for a very long time, sort of the only adventure structures that most game masters had or have is how to run a dungeon and then how to run a railroad. With a railroad being a structure where you just basically prep what the PCs are supposed to do, and then you force the players to do that one way or the other.
They try to guess what DM prepared to them this time, and it's like a game.
And follow those tracks exactly, and if you do it well, it is a perfectly adequate experience. But more often than not, it's a very fragile experience. It will likely break at the table, and then you as the game master will have a difficult time, and the players will have a difficult time. And the irony is that a lot of people, because those are the only structures they know, they think, well, I have to put things in this linear plot. This A happens, then B happens, then C happens, because that's the simplest way of doing it. And the irony is that it actually isn't. Like, forcing the players to do that specific sequence of things is difficult to prep. And it is difficult to run, and very, like I say, very fragile and very likely to break. But the problem is that when those are the only two structures you have, when your toolbox only has one tool in it, then you have to hit everything with that tool. And then the other problem, like we were talking about as well, is that actually, like, over the years, D&D has spent less and less time, and in 5th edition, no time, actually teaching new dungeon masters how to run dungeons. And so the knowledge that most people have about how to run dungeons is no longer sort of a primary, like, here's a specific procedure. It is this like 3rd or 4th degree telephone game where they've sort of received like a general understanding of how dungeons work, right? And so that structure has also deteriorated over the years to the point where you're now beginning to see actual published products, whether on DM's Guild or other places, where you have dungeons that like don't have a map, or it has a map, but there are no numbers on it. And the dungeon is just described as the sort of like running paragraph where you have to kind of like figure out where they've stuck the information for whatever room you happen to be in. And actually, like, one of the most recent Wizards of the Coast adventures, Shattered Obelisk, actually has a couple of dungeons where there's no map key, there's no numbers, and the dungeon is just described as a page full of text. And so the biggest flaw of the D&D of the official D&D 5th edition adventures is that they dream big. They want to accomplish these big things, but the only tool they have is the railroad. Is A happens, then B happens, and then C happens. And so whatever concept it is, whatever big dream they have about what this adventure is going to be, it always collapses back down into the most fragile and less satisfying adventure structure possible. And Dragon Heist is an example of this, where you're like, ooh, we want to, and we're going to market this as we have this amazing heist-based campaign. The problem is we don't actually know how to design heists and present heists or tell you how to run a heist, so actually skip it, no heists. We want to run this big political intrigue faction game, but that would mean like multiple factions all dynamically responding to the players, and like it would be really difficult to like script that, so we'll scrap that as well. And instead what you end up with in like the core of Dragon Heist from the moment when kind of the actual like intrigue of all the stuff with the Stone of Galore starts is the PCs go to the House of Gralhand, which is a dungeon. They experience a dungeon experience, and then someone steals the stone and goes running off with it, right? I mean, you know this, John, if you've looked at the original adventure. Someone goes running off with the stone, and then the published adventure is like, okay, and then the PCs chase them. And the PCs chase them for a while, and they come to another dungeon or a small like combat scenario, and then they try and get the stone, but at the last minute, somebody grabs the stone and goes running off with it again, so they chase them again. And so we end up with just this linear sequence of sort of very railroaded experiences where the players are never allowed to actually grab the stone. Something will always stop them, and somebody will always grab it and run away with it, because otherwise the next scene won't happen. And I actually refer to that as, this is a cultural reference that I'm guessing will not ring true in the Ukraine, but I refer to it as the Benny Hill sequence, because there's an English comedian who used to do shows, and every one of his skit shows would end with this chase sequence where he'd just be getting chased around London, basically, by a huge cast of characters. And that's what it felt like to me, was this kind of like just comedic chase sequence through Waterdeep, where you were just constantly chasing after the stone.
That makes sense.
It's official soundtrack of this campaign.
We will put background music on our interview there. Yeah.
Perfect. So long story short, is like I say, when the only tool you have is a railroad, every adventure looks like a nail you're going to have to hit with that railroad hammer. Mm-hmm. And whether that's, there's no heist in Dragon Heist, whether that's let's go explore actually maybe I shouldn't say this about Sin into Avernus for spoilers, but let's go explore this wilderness. We'll keep it general. Let's go explore this wilderness, but actually we're going to make it so it's impossible to explore the wilderness, and you just need to lead the players from one encounter to the next one by the nose. Whatever those experiences are, that's the underlying problem, is that no matter how cool the concept is, and frequently the concepts are super cool and they're super exciting, no matter how cool they are, they always end up being an NPC tells you where to go, and then there's another NPC there, and they tell you where to go, and then that NPC tells you, and it's a line of the PCs going on errand quests, and it's not exciting, it's not fun, it's fragile, and it breaks easily.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah. So coming to different topic. So you mentioned like your very first role-playing experience was with Batman. And then with a red box set of early Dungeons and Dragons. So, as I understand, you have experience with a lot of different systems. I remember, I can recall at least like besides D&D, I can recall like Cyberpunk, Blades in the Dark, like Unknown Armies, Call of Cthulhu, and also on other systems. So there was in the internet a lot of discussions about this. All those systems are different on the spectrum of narrative focus and rules heavy, like crunchy systems. So maybe you could share with us your opinion on those systems. Maybe tell us which one do you prefer, or maybe which system would you pick for different types of games. And the second follow-up question, I'll ask you, what system would you use for the people who know nothing about role-playing experience? What system would you bring to them?
That's a great question. I'm going to start with the first half and let the second half kind of percolate there. So There are a lot of different role-playing games out there, and something you said was along the lines of which system is best for each purpose. And I think that's really the best way I've learned to think about role-playing games. I know when I first got into the hobby, I spent a lot of time trying to focus on like what's the best system. And there was a real strong temptation back then, because back in the in the 80s and early 90s, there was a big emphasis on universal role-playing game systems like GURPS and so forth, where you'd have like one system and you'd use it for everything. And there's a lot of nice things about having a nice universal system in your back pocket that you like a lot, because it lets you kind of like use that quickly for game concepts you might have that don't fit into any existing games. But generally speaking, you want to have game systems that support the type of experience you want to have for a particular, whether it's a particular setting or a particular genre or the like. You mentioned Blades in the Dark by John Harper. That's a great example of a game that is designed very well to support the specific style of play that Blades in the Dark is aiming to do. In the case of specifically heists in a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting. And John Harper did an excellent job of laying out a specific structure of play. And that is something we've been seeing more and more of over, I think, the last decade, is games that are specifically going in saying, okay, well, what is the core structure of play? What is the core gameplay loop? And in many cases, what is the core scenario structure? And Blades in the Dark is a great example of doing both, where they both have a very strong structure for running heists, as a scenario, the core scenario of the game. And then also a very strong overall gameplay loop where heists lead into downtime, which then generates more opportunities to go on heists, which then generate the revenues you need to develop your criminal crew. And so getting all of those sort of gameplay loops and structures in line with each other is one of the most powerful things that a game system can do. Another good example of this is the Trail of Cthulhu role-playing game, which is sort of inspired by Call of Cthulhu from and Trail of Cthulhu is from Pelgrane Press. And like a really simple example of this, and Call of Cthulhu, of course, has the sanity system, and Trail of Cthulhu kind of iterates on the sanity system, where what they have is a stability and sanity system. So the way that works is in a given adventure, you have stability, which is being eroded away by the horrific experiences that you're having. And then if you run out of stability, then your sanity starts taking hits at that point. And in between adventures, your stability can recover, but your sanity can't. And so that is in contrast to Call of Cthulhu, where you just have a sanity score that goes down over time. And what I find nice about Trail of Cthulhu, this is an example of like which system would be best for you. Well, Call of Cthulhu is much better at sort of just a straight down, like everything is going to continue pile driving into the ground, because once you've lost sanity, you can't get it back. What Trail of Cthulhu offers in a very similar vein is a system in which, in the course of a single adventure, your stability can get dropped all the way down in a single adventure, and you can begin having like, oh no, I'm almost out of stability feeling, that panic that happens in that moment in a single adventure, and still but not have that only be the only adventure you can ever run. Because if you run through all of a character's sanity in Call of Cthulhu, that's it, they're done. The same doesn't happen in Trail of Cthulhu, but you still have then a separate sanity stat that over the long term tracks down. And so those create two different experiences at the table. And so that's one of those things where you need to experiment a little bit and figure out, well, what is the experience that I'm looking for, either in general with my sort of Lovecraftian mythos adventures, or specifically for this particular adventure. So those are the kinds of things I look for when trying to figure out if a particular game is appropriate for the experience that I'm looking for, is to look at those things. And to offer a third example, right now I'm running a campaign in Kenneth Height's Night's Black Agents system, which is also from Pelgrane Press, actually. And in that game, everyone plays spies who have retired and are working kind of like as mercenaries, and then they realize that vampires are real, and so then they have to go and use their spy skills to deal with a vampire conspiracy. And Kenneth Haidt does a couple of great things, again, much like John Harper in Blades in the Dark, where he has specific structures that support the specific style of play he's looking for. In this case, one of the major ones is called the Conspiramid, which is you basically build a pyramid diagram of nodes of the conspiracy that connect to each other. And then that conspiramid then links into certain mechanics that the players have access to in terms of how they investigate and target specific operations of the bad guy so that they can move up the pyramid to its pinnacle by a variety of routes. And those interactions within the game system are great at evoking this sort of like a spy drama conspiracy story. So that's another great example. One of my favorite games thinking about conspiracies is a game called Technoir, which was originally published by Jeremy Keller. And this is actually a case where I loved the game so much I bought the company, because Jeremy Keller left the role-playing game industry, and the game was going out of print. And so I approached him and actually picked up the rights to keep the game in print. And so now I keep the game in print. And Technoir is a game that similarly deals with conspiracies. What it does is a system that is called plot mapping. And so you don't actually have to do any prep before you run Technoir, because what you do is when you start play and when the players make their characters, rather, you as the game master generate from the setting information, you generate the central nodes of a plot map, and then various actions that the players take during play will mechanically add additional nodes to this plot map. And so both you and the players are exploring the conspiracy together and discovering just how far the conspiracy reaches. And it creates that sort of noir genre conspiracy investigation feel within a cyberpunk setting. That was a bit of a ramble, but somewhere in there, hopefully, was a discussion of various games that I like and the reasons why I think certain games are good for certain genres. What was the second half of the question?
Second one was, which system would you pick to introduce entirely new players to role-playing system?
New players, entirely new. To some extent, this kind of also depends on who are the players you're trying to introduce. One of the biggest advices I give, if you have completely new players that you're looking to introduce, and assuming we'll start with experienced game master, because like game mastering for the first time is actually kind of a separate thing. But if you're a game master looking to introduce a game to new players, the first thing you want to ask those players is what types of books and films and graphic novels do you enjoy? Do you like fantasy? Do you like science fiction? Do you like cyberpunk? And then you want to find a game that matches the things that they already care about. This is a big thing. This is a big thing in the 90s, where everybody would get into role-playing games through D&D, which was great if you were excited by sort of the D&D-esque, Tolkien-esque fantasy. But if you didn't like fantasy, then it didn't matter how accessible the game was. You were going to bounce off all the pointy ears and short dwarves and so forth. So that's the first thing, is try and find the game that works for people. The second thing that I'm looking for is that I think a common error that people have who've been playing for a long time, when they talk about, what would be appealing to a new player, is they're like, what would be really appealing for a new player is like a super simple system. One of those systems that there's just like a dice rolling mechanic, and that's kind of all they give you, and then it's all in your imagination. And that can work. But in a lot of cases, in my experience, what new players are looking for is a really clear answer about, what are we doing here? Like, how do I actually play this game? Partly because they're used to other games where they're given very specific answers of like, well, you roll the dice and you move around the board, or, whatever the game might be. And so a lot of new players are just like, I don't know what to do. So if I'm an experienced game master introducing players to a game, one of the things I'll look at is both mechanically, does that game make it very clear how character creation works? I want to make sure, for those new players particularly, that the character creation system has what I refer to as comprehensible questions that they can understand. So, for example, there are games where they're like, here's a list of 36 skills, and here are 100 points. Spend the 100 points between the 36 skills. Well, for a new player, like, they're just like, I don't know what this choice is. I don't know what these skills do. I don't understand how the game works. I don't really understand what we're going to be doing with these characters when we get into the adventure. That choice means nothing to them. The opposite end of that is like the original 1974 version of D&D, which says, okay, take 3d6, roll your 3 stats in order, no choices, just roll them. 2, pick a class. You probably want to pick the class that has the highest ability score. 3, pick a race. 4, you're done. Let's play the game. And so, that kind of like all those choices that the player is making, like, do you want to be a fighter, a wizard, or a cleric, or a thief? Well, I know what those things are, so I can make that choice, even if I've never played a role-playing game before. Do you want to be a human, an elf, or a dwarf, or a halfling? I know what those things are, assuming I have any exposure to fantasy whatsoever, or they can be quickly explained to me, and that's a comprehensible choice. So those are the choices in character creation I'm looking for those new players. And I do feel that I want the new character to actually make their character. You can kind of compensate for this if you're playing a system with a lot of choices they wouldn't understand by giving them a pre-generated character. Mm-hmm. But I find that process of creating a character almost immediately invests a new player in. Like there's something captivating about, ooh, I made this person, and now I'm curious about what this person's going to do. There's just something about that really pulls players in. Pre-gens work in a pinch. There's nothing wrong with pre-gens. But ideally, I want to have them make that character where they feel like I made this thing. So even if I use pre-gens, I try to leave a couple of comprehensible choices in those pre-gens so that they kind of like finalize the pre-gen and customize it and still feel some sort of authorship or ownership over that character. So those are the things I'm looking for in that sense. And then when I'm running a new adventure for new players, it can be there's a lot of different types of adventures you can run, but whatever that adventure is, something I want to look for is what I refer to as sort of the default action of the adventure. And what that is like, if you don't know what you should be doing, what is something you can always do? So, for example, in a dungeon scenario, for example, if you're sitting in a room in a dungeon and you don't know what you should be doing right now, the default action is pick an exit, walk through it, and find another room, right? If you're playing a hex crawl wilderness exploration, you're standing out in the wilderness and you don't know what you should be doing right now, you don't have a goal, you're like, I don't know what to do. You can always pick a direction and start walking. If you're in a mystery scenario, the default action is figure out where you can look for clues and then go look for clues there and then see what happens, right? So those are all kind of the default actions. And with new players, I will often be very explicit about, hey, this is, if you have no idea what you should be doing, here's what you can always do. And that default action means that they never feel lost because they're never in that position of being like, well, I don't know what to do, because they always know there's something they can do. And it gives them a lot of confidence to then begin. And people are like, well, that if that's all you're doing, it's right. That's why it's a default action, because there's always like, you're in a dungeon room, there's 18 things to do that are cool. There's goblins to fight, there's puzzles to solve, there's a weird tapestry to look at, there's a bunch of books, there's all those things to do. It's just when you aren't sure about what you should be doing, or none of those things interest you, or you've done all of those things, you pick the exit and walk through it. So that's for the player side. Now, if you're a first-time GM getting into gaming, the best games for them, I'll be honest, like I'm a little bit biased. Like I'm going to say, Magical Kitties Save the Day is a lovely role-playing game designed by Matthew Hansen that I and Matthew and Michelle Nephew designed the second edition of. And for that second edition, I put the game in a box and I added a choose your own adventure graphic novel so that the new player on opening the box for the first time can pick that graphic novel up and immediately start playing the game, quote unquote, by reading through this graphic novel where you'll create your character and experience the sort of like choices you'll make during a typical game of Magical Kitties. So you can play that game within minutes of opening the box, which is a great experience, because so often you're a first time player, you get the role playing game and then you're like, oh, I got to go find players. So I guess it's going to be weeks before I can actually play this thing. So that's the game that I designed specifically for first-time game masters learning how to be a game master for the first time, and even first-time players. But it does sort of assume that people will be interested in Magical Kitties, which we have discovered is a much wider audience. Everybody loves kitties.
That's true.
So that'll be my go-to answer. But in terms of what's currently available on the market, the D&D starter sets are still some of the best ones out there. The Call of Cthulhu, and so the other thing too is obviously like all the advice I'm giving here in terms of specific systems, I'm not sure how applicable that is to the Ukrainian audience potentially listening to this.
Yeah, pretty applicable. Yeah.
Right. But the Call of Cthulhu starter set is usually also very good. It has very specific instructions on how to run Call of Cthulhu style.
It also
adventures.
has been recently translated to Ukraine officially, so
that's fantastic.
Even sells in our local game stores.
Yeah, I would definitely check that one out then. And then sort of the second tier beyond that is the games that are not specifically designed necessarily to be as newcomer friendly as possible, but that have very specific structures. So John Harper's Blades in the Dark, a little harder to get into because it's asking the GM to juggle a lot more. But that very specific structure of here's how you prep a session, here's how you run a session is very useful. As is, we talked about Nice Black Agents as well. I mean, we talked about these things because they had these interesting game structures in them. But in my experience, those specific structures is what makes them accessible. And then, of course, the single best thing you can do is you can buy a copy of So You Want to Be a Game Master by Justin Alexander, which is specifically designed to help first-time game masters walk into this brave new world of role-playing games.
Yeah, your answer can be turned into flow charts. So let's say, are you an UBDM or experience? Yeah, the yes, no, and then you go by boxes. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are
Speaking
actually...
about genre games, I found that I liked Mothership, which is a game about space horror, basically, which I unexpectedly liked because it's simple, it has a genre, and it makes super simple to run and players super simple to play because a lot of people are so familiar with the genre, means it's easy to improvise and figure out like default action as you would describe it, what to do and all that.
That's really awesome. I backed the Mothership Kickstarter for their big box set, and that is apparently supposed to be shipping very soon now. It's been very delayed, and I've been waiting to dive into Mothership until I get my Kickstarter box. So I'm excited. I'm excited to hear such good things about it.
In 5 years, or maybe even more.
It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those are great points of view, and I'm very glad that you mentioned separately the game system for players and for game masters, because it's, in my opinion, underrated opinion that a lot of people think that to run a game, to GM, you should actually play as a player first, if it makes sense. And one of the purposes of our channel, one of our philosophies, if you like so, that you don't need to be a player to run your field game. So you can be like, you can start your journey in a role-playing game and system by running a game. It's not like, GM is not like second level, next level, next tier of a player. It's like separate fun, and it's important that the GM would have a lot of fun also running the game. It's not the job, it's not like service for players. Yeah, so thank you about it.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. Like, yeah, I mean, certainly my experience was being a GM first, and it is 100% possible to do that, and there's no reason not to do it that way.
So, Justin, you mentioned, or probably that Alex mentioned, that's a known Armies game, right? So we haven't introduced this game yet on our channel. So for those who don't know what this is all about, this is a cult urban fantasy game about, as far as I remember, broken people who try to make the broken world slightly a better place or something like this. So a question to you, why do you like the Unknown Armies? If you do, I hope you do. And what makes that game stand out among other urban fantasy games like, let's say, World of Darkness, City of Mist, or Dresden Files?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Unknown Armies is actually, I have to confess my bias as the RPG developer at Atlas Games. That's one of the games we publish and I oversee. It's a game by Greg Stolze and John Tynes that first appeared in the 90s. And I mean, you did a great job describing it. I often think of it as sort of Tim Powers, the role-playing game, as my personal touchstone for it. Tim Powers writes a lot of weird conspiracy, pseudo-mystical, sort of urban fantasy kind of stuff. And a lot of Unknown Armies has a very similar vibe to it. I think the thing that makes it stand out from other games, there are a few things. One is just that very unique point of view that Greg Stolze and John Tynes brings to it of these broken people. Like, if we're going to do straight comparisons, like World of Darkness has broken monsters, which is different than broken people, right? And and compared to like a game like Call of Cthulhu, which is another game like Unknown Armies, it features like a sanity-like system that looks at how people break as a result of the extreme circumstances that they're in. But Unknown Armies sort of version of that system is multipolar, where there's several different sort of like the several different factors that we look at, and it's more of a balancing act as well between sanity and insanity, and that the game looks at it specifically through that lens. The other thing that the game kind of has going for it as a result of the Tim Powers feel that I was talking about is that it looks at the modern world from a very mortal perspective, and the ways in which magic works is about the exploitation of mortal frailty, if that kind of makes sense. Like most of the ways that you gain sort of access to magic in Unknown Armies is that you build up charges by doing generally terrible or broken things. Like there's a dipsomancer who's basically has to be an alcoholic and drunk in order to access their powers. Or there's another sort of magical class where you have to murder people in order to get your charges, or you have to burn books to get your powers. Like there's all kinds of like broken things you have to do. There's sacrifices you have to make for that power. And I think that's a good word, sacrifice. That the game is constantly challenging you to make sacrifices in order to achieve your goals, whether those goals are power or whatever the goal might be. Whether in order to make the world a slightly better place, like you said, Tony, you have to break yourself to do it. And that constant tension between self and power, between self and even selflessness, and the sacrifices we have to make is kind of the engine that I feel makes Unknown Armies feel like a very unique experience when you get into it.
On that note, I just realized the meaning of the name of your blog. Sorry, I just got back in my mind to the previous question where you said that you put all your written articles into a repository, which is basically like the Library of Alexandria, right? So
that's right. Yep.
Finally, sorry, that was a revelation all of a sudden here.
Yep, it's definitely 100% a play on my last name and also the Library of Alexandria.
Right. Sorry, please go on.
No.
So let's continue a lovely conversation about different systems, and I'm very interested in your opinion. If you had any chance to check out the new systems by Darrington Press, by Critical Role publisher, I would say there are both Candela Obscura and Daggerheart. We actually with Tony had the chance to playtest this game, open beta system. So, and we think that it's like an attempt to create more narrative system, definitely more rules light, and focus more on the storytelling aspect of the game. And we think that it's like also is an impact from the streaming services, streaming of the live play games, as we thought before, in corresponding genres. So can you share your opinion on it? Maybe you had a chance to check out both Candela Obscura and Daggerheart, and maybe what do you think about them as a near future of this of this industry of tabletop RPGs?
Yeah, so right up front, I haven't had a chance to check out Daggerheart yet. Checking out the beta test is definitely on my list of things to do, but I haven't had a chance to do that yet. I have taken a bit of a look at Candela Obscura, although only the quick start version that came out a few months ago. I know the full game came out 2 months ago. Time has kind of lost a little bit of meaning here recently for me. But I haven't had a chance to look at the full version of that either. So my commentary will be somewhat limited here. I did actually, among the many things I do, I run a YouTube channel for the Alexandrian. So I did actually do a video on the Candela Obscura RPG. My takeaways were mostly positive from my experiences, both looking at that game and doing some sort of playtest analysis of it. The setting's really interesting. For those not familiar with it, it is meant to be kind of like a contemporary setting, but not our world. And then also there's magic, which is also hidden and also kind of horrific. And so there's kind of interesting layers to the setting that I quite like. The system is heavily inspired by games like Blades in the Dark that we talked about previously. Some of the creators have previously worked on Blades in the Dark. John Harper has done some stuff for the game as well. I know there's a big controversy with it when it first came out, with people being like, "Oh my goodness, this game is using mechanics from Blades in the Dark and they're stealing it." And I'm like, man, maybe I'm just getting old, but like, don't every role-playing game use mechanics from other role-playing games, from other games? I think even like if you look at like the original edition of D&D, the original edition of D&D is like, hey, we took a bunch of cool mechanics from chainmail and outdoor survival in these other games. So I'm not sure there's ever been an RPG that hasn't been like, hey, let's go loot somebody's corpse for a bunch of cool mechanics and see what happens when we kit bash them together. So overall, like I said, I don't have a lot of experience with them. Candela Obscura is very intriguing to me. I did have some reservations with Candela Obscura, where the rule book was constant being like, well, we don't want to have like any like we don't want to have any sort of mental illnesses or physical handicaps in this game that would be unpolitically correct. But here's our whole system for generating mental handicaps and other problems. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute. So there's sort of a tension within Candela Obscura in that sense that I found to be potentially problematic for the game in terms of what it wanted to be versus maybe what the rulebook was telling you it wanted to be. But a lot of interesting stuff there. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to check out Daggerheart yet, so I don't really have much of a commentary on its mechanics yet. I am interested in checking it out. They have a really fantastic team of designers working on everything there at Darrington Press. And so pretty much anything they're doing, I'm going to be interested in checking out. In terms of the other half of your question, which is like the influence of streaming on game design and the ways in which we run our games, it would be impossible for anyone to ignore the fact that streaming does have a very large impact on this. And part of this is what we were talking about earlier, which is that, if we talk about that 10-year-old kid who was looking to get into role-playing games and was kind of surrounded by like a few examples here and there of being able to see like characters in ET playing role-playing games, seeing advertisements in comic books about what the game was about. Now I could just go on Twitch and watch hours and hours of content of seeing actual people play these games before I ever played the game for myself, or even potentially had a rule book to sit down and read through and see what that's doing. So actual play is providing even for people who are actually playing the game. Like maybe you get together once a week or once every 2 weeks for 4 hours, but in between those sessions, you could be watching dozens of hours of Dimension 20 and Critical Role and other actual play shows, large and small. And so it has an outsized influence. And one thing to be aware of, as I'm sure you're aware, is that there are things about streaming that make it a unique experience that is not 100% representative of what a home table game is going to look like. And I think that can also be overstated in some cases. There's a lot of people that will be like, "Oh, Critical Role scripts everything," and I'm like, that's not what's going on in that game. But what is true is that you have a whole bunch of people, including the players, who are all being paid to sit at that table, whose job is to come and play that role-playing game, to prepare for playing that role-playing game. And that all by itself is a huge bias on how the game is played. Like, just in terms of the fact that even the fact that they're on camera, like as someone who's done some minimal actual play experience myself, being on camera and knowing that there's dozens or hundreds or thousands of people watching you play, you're going to be pretty focused on what's going on at that table.
Yeah, indeed.
And for those who've run any game, whether it's a board game or a role-playing game, that in a casual parlor game that the focus isn't always there. We're coming from a job where maybe we were working for 8 or 10 hours and we're exhausted some nights, and some nights we're just not feeling it, and some nights like we have a sick cat that we're thinking about. Like whatever the case may be, that's the biggest difference for me in streaming games, is that that those players are going to be focused and the GM is going to be 100% on their game. And in some cases, the video will be edited to remove anything else where those things are. So there is a degree of like where that bias comes into play. And then other actual plays will be much more heavy-handed in other ways in terms of trying to shape a compelling experience as well. And those all have impacts on it. But like, coming back all the way back around again in terms of these games, yeah, we're seeing an increasing number of games that are coming, that the flow has been reversed, that we're seeing games that are coming out of these actual play experiences specifically because people want to capture those experiences that they're seeing on the screen. One thing that amazes me is that we haven't seen yet, as far as I know, any instance of somebody running a campaign for actual play and then publishing a version of that campaign that people can play at home. I think there's been a few inklings in that direction, but I don't think there's any examples I can think of where people have actually done that. I think that's inevitable. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that's handled. One of the difficulties will be understanding how to have a structure that is accessible and creates unique play experiences. So anyways, that's a bit of a ramble, but.
I see.
Turning back to Candela Obscura, in my opinion, like those, as you mentioned, political issues are not as a big deal as game design issues in the game. But turning from that, the main point is why is Candela Obscura? Yeah? Why not other systems? Why does it exist? Because every system needs to have its purpose, needs to bring something new into tabletop RPGs. And after my thoughts of it, I come to conclusion that Candela Obscura tries to create new version of horror RPGs as a genre in the system, because in my experience of trying Call of Cthulhu and a lot of different other horror systems, it's more like Call of Cthulhu-ish, if you could say so. So you cannot escape the Lovecraft theme. You cannot escape those all of forgotten gods, outer gods, etc., etc. Even if it has no Cthulhu, it still has those vibes. So Candela Obscura tries to stay in the spot, but create new experience for it. And yeah, it's a tough path for them. They chosen a very hard thing to do, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't if I was launching an RPG company, I wouldn't necessarily be like, hey, the first thing I should do is go try and tackle Call of Cthulhu head to head. That's a big ask. And like the only thing I would do less than that would be to go try and tackle D&D head to head, which I guess to some extent they then immediately did with Daggerheart. So yeah, like I think there is that they chose a very tough hill to charge up. And I think to some extent are only able to do that because of the strength of Critical Role and the Critical Role fandom, and their willingness to kind of charge up that hill with them.
Definitely. Speaking of new things and like fresh air in the RPG systems, let's say, there was a big like upheaval after some D&D controversies. People start discovering OSR, Old School Revival, community and movement at large en masse. And apparently there are like systems to run a dungeon, and there are like game structures for a lot of things. And when I discovered that for myself, I was just stunned how much creativity is there if you get like that framework, which is Old School Essentials, for example, by Gavin Norman. It created like a big cauldron of creativity, which spawned a lot of interesting material, zines and supplements and adventures. Like also all those systems are compatible for the most part with the all the decades of published material for any old like first or second edition, whatever. It doesn't matter that much. My personally favorite system is Worlds Without Number. Also, you can take it, you can run some old adventure, for example, Against the Code of the Reptile God or something else. It works almost seamlessly. You have to do some work, but still. What do you think about it? I think they also like kind of solved some problems that you solved with game structures on your blog, maybe.
Yeah, I'm very old school revival, which is that like I've been involved with the OSR in one way or another for over a decade now. Was kind of there from like ground zero, so to speak. And the OSR had a major impact on some of the game structure stuff we were talking about. There's a lot of different sort of old school revivals or old school renaissances. And everybody who comes to it has a slightly different reason for engaging with it. Some people are engaging with it because they really want sort of a what they call like a gritty fantasy Vietnam. They want sort of like a very deadly, very dangerous environment, either for aesthetic reasons or because they feel like that's a really interesting challenge to overcome if you're always facing a meaningful threat of death, which is something I think has become less true overall in D&D, for example, over the years, whereas it used to be very common for like low-level characters in particular to have that fantasy Vietnam kind of feel to it. So some people are attracted to that. What attracted me to the old school Renaissance specifically was this idea of digging into some of the earliest role-playing games and earliest role-playing game adventures, and sort of looking at some of the roads we didn't follow. That there were these interesting scenario structures, these interesting forms of playing the game that used to be very common. And then there was a lot of experimentation in the early days of role-playing games in the 1970s. And then things kind of narrowed in on one particular type of role-playing overall. And linear storytelling became very popular for a variety of reasons, for example, and other forms of play kind of like drifted away. We also already talked about how like there used to be very specific instructions for how to prep and run a dungeon, and those things have kind of faded away as well. Well, it turns out that there were other things back at the dawn of the industry and the hobby that people were experimenting with. It also faded away. A good example of this is like hex crawls, for example, as a way of running wilderness adventures. And that was a really interesting example to look back on, because in the early days, there was a specific procedure that you followed to run a hex crawl, the way you keyed the hexes, the way that the characters moved between the hexes and so forth. And then by the end of the 1980s, by the time I was getting into role-playing games for the first time, all of those procedures had kind of died away. They weren't really in the books anymore. They weren't in the D&D rule books anymore. But the interesting thing is that for years after that, TSR, who were the publishers of D&D back then, TSR would continue publishing all of their wilderness maps as hex maps, even though the underlying structure of that sort of no longer existed. And then eventually about the mid-90s, they were like, why are we doing this? And they stopped publishing hex maps. And then it was really over a decade later that a company called Necromancer Games, who had gotten their start with third edition D&D, publishing under the tagline, third edition rules, first edition feel, which was a very early example of people beginning to kind of want to retouch back to those early aesthetics and mechanics and so forth. They published something called they started with the City State of the Invincible Overlord, and then they did the Wilderlands of High Fantasy. And the Wilderlands of High Fantasy specifically was a very early hex crawl product from a company called Judges Guild, and they were revamping it for a modern audience. And so they kind of reintroduced these hex crawl structures, and that was another sort of major influence on the early OSR. And those are the things that I kind of came to the OSR and was kind of experimenting with. Like, let's explore what this hex crawl is interesting. How did Traveller handle it? Traveller being an early science fiction role-playing game. How did they handle different structures for how they approached play? Why was Traveller, for example, publishing a book called 76 Patrons that just consisted of a list of 76 NPCs? Like, why did that book exist? And it turns out that there was actually a whole structure of play that assumed that the players could go to any star system on the map, and then when they got there, the GM would need to have raw material to sort of improvise within the structure of the game. And one of the key structures was the idea that in starports there would be these patrons who would hire the PCs to do jobs. So the reason why there was a source book that said here's 76 of them was because the GM needed that many, the GM needed that resource as part of the structure of play. But if you don't understand the structure of play, you're just left thinking, why does this book exist? And so there's a lot of really interesting things along those lines. And I know I'm rambling again, but that's kind of how I came through the OSR and why I find the OSR fascinating. Now, the interesting thing over the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years at this point, is that the OSR has kind of moved into a new phase, a new era, where we've kind of all finished exploring everything that was done back then. And there's always a new generation coming in who can go re-explore that as well. But in terms of the movement, everyone kind of finished exploring that. We've mined all these sort of like, ooh, look at this thing we forgot about kind of things. And now we're kind of interested in exploring new things. And World Without Number and all of those games by Kevin are a great example of how to take that next step and sort of revise those systems down. And then also you get really, really amazingly inventive and creative settings, like the Electric Bastion lands, for example, or the UVG setting. Ultraviolet Grasslands is a great one. These are all really fantastic imaginative settings that are surprisingly accessible because they are using those sort of old school structures to let you access them. Whereas like sometimes you'll get like really imaginative creative settings, and you're like, I have no idea how to run this or how to introduce this to my players. But the OSR seems to have a really interesting angle on being able to do that because there's these easy, accessible sort of baseline structures, these default actions, these default goals for the players and the game masters to interact with.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that note, about this whole old school renaissance, D&D actually does that as well, right? So they went from 3rd edition, then they went to more simplified, some say casual 5e, and then they are getting back to some more complicated stuff, right? So with their one D&D, which is now Unearthed Arcana, right, material. So did you have a chance to look into that one D&D, so to say? And what is your opinion? Are Wizards moving towards something that would be new improvement, new edition, better edition, improvement, or if not, what are they missing?
Yeah, so reading the tea leaves on 1D&D or 6th edition D&D or D&D 2024, whatever we end up calling the thing, is an interesting position to be in. And I've certainly gazed into those tea leaves quite a bit and tried to ordain their meaning. But I think that to some extent I've reached the point I'm just like, I'm just going to wait and see what happens this fall when the Player's Handbook comes out to see what they're going to do. And part of the reason for that is I think that realistically, we're seeing the tip of the iceberg of this playtest material popping up, and it's difficult to know how representative that playtest material is of whatever the game that's actually coming out is. And there's a number of reasons for that. First off, inherently, any playtest material is probably going to be pretty radical, just to see how far they can push, just to see what they can play around with. And then usually, not always, but usually, whether this is D&D or Pathfinder or other games that have done playtests like this, you will see like a pullback where they pull back into what actually worked. And so the actual game will usually be more conservative than that. So yes, there's been a tons of stuff suggesting they're going to push the game in really interesting and far-flung ways. Whether or not we actually see that in the books that actually get published is kind of open for interpretation. An example of this is going back to like 2012 when they started the D&D Next playtest that would become 5th edition, bouncing off of the largely considered failed 4th edition of the game. There was all kinds of stuff in that playtest material that just never made it to the final book. One example of this is actually the playtest material included a dungeon turn system that was heavily influenced by the original dungeon turns by Gygax and Arneson, and that you'll see a similar system, and so you want to be a game master, similarly inspired by a long chain of creators from Gygax and Arneson. But that's not in the final rulebook. It's just one example that kind of sticks out. So there's that aspect of like, how much are they actually testing, and how much is this actually representative? The other thing too is that there's a lot of things in the tea leaves that suggest that like the actual goals of what this new edition of D&D, or this new, definitely not an edition as they often say now, of D&D, what the actual goals internally are it's fairly clear, and to be clear, I don't really have a lot of internal access to WotC, so this is a lot of speculation. But it feels fairly clear from sort of, again, the tea leaves in my cup, that the project was initiated when Ray Winninger was in charge of the D&D team. And it was primarily initiated with, hey, let's clean up the books a bit and release new ones for the 50th edition of D&D, because that'd be a cool thing to do for the 50th edition of D&D. And by a cool thing, I mean, I think we'll sell a lot of books and make money. And I think the initial intention was just we'll put the errata in there, we'll do a little bit of cleanup, it'll be fine. And then Ray left the company. So like that initial vision, whatever the initial vision of this game was, it left the company. And then at some point in here, other executives from Hasbro came in and said, wouldn't it be great if we revoked the open gaming license, made it so the game had to run on digital platforms and shut down all the digital platforms we didn't own, because that's a really great way to make money too. And so the only way to make that work would have been to make radical changes to the system so that you could break compatibility with the older editions of the game, thereby forcing people who were playing the current edition. So at some point in there was a, hey, let's break the game and make it a new game that you can't use the OGL with kind of influence that was happening within this design process, which was a very similar process to what happened in 2008 when D&D 4th edition came out, where they said, we don't want to have the OGL anymore, so we're going to make a game that is completely different so that you can't use any of the OGL with it, since we can't close that door. We're going to do that and make a completely new game. And like I just said, that didn't work out so well for them. And then so that happened. Then the OGL fiasco happened at the beginning of last year, and that all blew up in their face, and they were losing millions of dollars on people canceling their D&D Beyond subscriptions. So apparently, again, reading the tea leaves, the people in charge of that decision were pushed out, and different people who'd been saying this is a terrible idea were allowed to move back in and kind of take control of sort of the direction of things. So at that point, you're like, well, okay, but all of that means, if you're looking at like the future of D&D, it's a project that was incorporating the errata and then radically transforming the game and then trying to hedge our bets and then recommitting to the OGL. And so even from the standpoint of like, what is the actual goal that Wizards of the Coast and the design team at Wizards of the Coast is trying to achieve is in the tea leaves, and you kind of have to read those. So that's why I've kind of reached the point of just being like, I don't know, let's see what happens in 2024. My hope is that they have learned from the chaos, particularly the OGL fiasco, that they remember the lessons of D&D 4th edition and where that went wrong, and that what we will see is, in fact, what they've been saying they're going to deliver, which is a new version of the game that will clean things up a little bit, that will make some changes that are perhaps a little bit surprising, but that will fundamentally remain compatible with the existing 5th edition product line. Because partly right now, the 5th edition D&D product line is a golden goose. The game is selling better than it's ever sold. And the risk of releasing these books at all is that you are risking killing the golden goose. And I really hope they don't do that, because a healthy D&D is good for the RPG industry as a whole, for better or for worse. And I'm a little bit nervous because, historically speaking, I lived through this back in 2003, going even further back, when they transitioned from Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition to Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, where similarly in the lead up to 3.5, they're like, this is just a minor revision of the game. We're not going to change anything. It's going to be 100% compatible with everything you already own. And then 3.5 came out and they said, actually, everything you own is garbage. Go buy the new books. And that had a really outsized impact both on D&D, but also on the entire third-party market that had taken them at their word and continued developing 3rd edition material and publishing 3rd edition material on the assumption it would still be sellable to 3.5 players. And it really was. Like, 3.5 actually wasn't a significant shift in the game mechanics overall, but the marketing team at Wizards wanted it to be. And so they presented it that way. And so players believed that. And suddenly all the retailers who had purchased this all these 3.0 books, all those retailers had bought those books believing they would still be able to sell them. Suddenly they couldn't. So they had a ton of capital locked down in books they suddenly couldn't sell to anybody. A lot of local game stores went out of business. A lot of game publishers went out of business. That's my fear about what could happen in 2024 and 2025, depending on how how Wizards of the Coast handles this rollout. So if I was in the business today of selling D&D supplements, which thankfully that is not my primary line of business currently, I would be very nervous. In 2003, it actually knocked me out of the industry for several years, because at the time I was working on a lot of third-party D&D stuff, and a lot of that stuff either I never got paid for because the companies went out of business, or it never got published at all because the companies realized that the manuscripts were unusable because 3.5 would come out. So I would be very nervous if I was in the business of selling D&D stuff right now, is my takeaway. And I hope that my nervousness will prove to be just nerves and not a serious prognostication of danger.
Yeah, we all hope. Yep.
Yeah.
We all hope.
Fingers crossed.
Yep.
Yeah. So we almost run over time, so I'll ask the last question. Think of it like a blitz question, like very short answer. Forgive me for maybe somehow ignorant question, but what would be the best your advice for the GM who want to write and maybe publish their very first adventure?
In terms of breaking into the industry, the best thing you can do actually is to just write and publish that first adventure. As someone who's been in the position of hiring people to be writers on various games, the first thing I ask them when they approach me and say, "What can I do?" I'll say, "Hey, can you send me a sample of your writing?" And you'd be amazed at how many of them are like, "I don't have any writing I can send you." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know how I'm supposed to hire you then." So the biggest thing you can do to like take that first step is to just take that first step. And the great thing is that was an incredibly difficult step for me to take when I was first trying to break into the industry back in the 90s, because the only option was to keep going to people and being like, "Hey, can I write for you?" And they'd be like, "Do you have anything published?" And you'd be like, "No." And they'd be like, "Okay, well, maybe." And you just slam your head into that wall over and over again until something breaks for you. Now, whether it's drive-through RPG or just publishing on blogs, there's lots of different ways that you can reach out directly to an audience to make something and get it out there in a way that I'm kind of envious of, because it was something I was unable to do back in the day. And so that's the thing. It's like, do that. The other thing in terms of like to a very specific advice, if you want to publish an adventure, to zone in on that, if you want to publish an adventure as a GM, there are two things. First off, remember that you as a writer are a collaborator with the game master who has to run your material. The person who's reading your book, the game master who's reading your book, is not your audience, in the sense that you aren't trying to surprise them. You aren't trying to be like, "Isn't this an amazing twist?" You want the GM that you're writing the book for to be given the tools to create those amazing twists for their players. And there's so many published books that get this wrong, where like you'll be reading through the book and saying like, "Oh, there's an amazing twist where if I'd known that, I wouldn't have screwed up an hour and a half ago, but I did, and here we are now." And there's even companies who, I will not name names, but there's even companies who will publish adventures over the course of several, like a collection of books. And like in book 5, you'll discover, "Oh, actually, so-and-so was the villain the whole time." You're like, that would have been really useful information to know at the beginning of this campaign. So that's the one thing, is think of the GM as your collaborator, and you want to give them the information to successfully run an adventure. And so one thing that I really want to see in more adventures is, at the beginning of the adventure, you should give a really good comprehensive overview of the adventure. And what I want to see in that is it's kind of like what do I want to say here? It's kind of a combination of like expanded table of contents and index and all of that, in the sense that this overview should tell the GM, here's all the things you can find in this book, include page references, doesn't hurt. And also, here's why they're here and how I expect you to use them, and how they connect to each other, and how the players will navigate through this adventure. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but like probably need a couple of pages that need to look at like, "Hey, there's these 3 dungeons. In dungeon A, they're going to find a map that takes them to dungeon B. Don't make me read all the way through dungeon A and then discover in room 57, oh, there's a map. That's how they get to dungeon B." That should be something that I know up front, so I can understand how this material is going to be used. So those are my 2 tips: is think of the GM, think of the audience as a collaborator, and as a result of that, right up front, tell them, "This is what I'm giving you. These are the toys I'm giving you, and here's how you're going to play with them. Good luck."
Yeah, those
All
are
right.
actually great advices from you. Thank you.
Great. Let's wrap this up. So before we wrap this up, I guess we should mention, maybe we will cut that. That depends on the results of other things. So we are negotiating with the publisher about Ukrainian translation of your book. So the publisher is open to that. We are waiting from our side for our. We have a company here locally that specializes in publishing board games and TTRPG material. So they are actually doing a translation of Vampires the Masquerade 5th edition. So I hope they can pick up this as their next project. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe just a few words for your expanding fan base in Ukraine.
Well, I will just say I'm so excited to be able to reach out and find all of you. I hope when you reach out and find my work, whether it's at the Alexandrian website, whether it's at my YouTube channel, or whether it's my book, So You Want to Be a Game Master, that you find something that will help you. That is the biggest thing that I have as a personal goal, is I just want to be able to help people become the best game masters that they can be. And I am honored and consistently humbled by the number of people who thankfully do find those things to be true of my work. And I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to help as much as I can.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for your time. And I really, really hope that we did not bore you to death with our multi-layered questions.
No, it was absolutely delightful. Thank you again so much for having me on.
Yeah, we hope that maybe after some time we'll see you again and we'll talk about something even more nerdy.
I would very much enjoy that. You should feel free to reach out to me anytime. I would be happy to come back.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot then. We'll say goodbye now.
We'll see you all soon.
Thanks for coming.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Have a great week. Bye.